Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2022 midterm election government relations update. We'll get started in just a minute here as we still have several people joining. If you want to let us know where you're coming from in the chat in the meantime. I am coming from a very rainy Northern Virginia. I've got 1:01 on my clock here, and we will get started in about 1 minute. We're just going to allow a few more people to join before we get started.
I see we have folks from some good election states: Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Big Senate races. Arizona.
All right, well, I will go ahead and get started with some opening remarks, and we'll just have people continue to join as we go through that. So welcome everyone to today's quarterly GR update. Please note that today's Zoom webinar is being recorded. My name's Keely Darty. I'm the Manager of Education and Events here at NAEA, and I will be today's technology webinar moderator. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. To ask questions of the speaker, please use the Q&A box. We will not be taking questions from the chat box. To ask questions of the moderator about NAEA or a technical issue, or to chat with the greater webinar audience, please use the chat box. Remember, when making a comment to the whole webinar, to choose all panelists and attendees. If you have a technical issue and would like to send me a direct message, that's an option as well. I'd like to introduce Megan Killian, Executive Vice President of NAEA, to get us started today.
Thanks, Keely. Welcome, everybody, to our quarterly GR update webinar. We are very pleased to have Thad Ng with us today, who is from our lobbyist firm, Vance Goyak. And he's going to provide some information about the midterm election and the impact it may have. I'd like to note that, despite whatever your political persuasions are, the next Congress is certainly going to have a big impact on who's running the IRS next and the IRS administration in general. So I urge you to participate, talk to your legislators, and make sure that all the funding and support they just got is put to good use. And the NAEA will be talking to them about this as well. So I'm sure Thad will get into that a little bit. So I will kick it over to him now. Thanks, Thad.
Great. Thanks, Meg, and thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Keely. Excited to be with everyone today to talk about the 2022 midterm elections. This presentation is a little different than what we normally do in that it's pretty political and election heavy in terms of what we'll be covering. And so there won't be a lot of tax policy and that kind of thing, but we will get in a little bit at the end and sort of what the impacts of some of these elections will have and how what the makeup of Congress is and what the leadership looks like going into next year. But obviously we are now, I guess, just over a month from the election. And Congress finally, I shouldn't say finally, but they finished up last week. They passed a continuing resolution on Friday to fund the government until December 16th. So it was a temporary spending measure since the fiscal year ended at the end of September. And they wrapped up a few other things. And the Senate was supposed to come back for 2 weeks to do the National Defense Authorization Bill in October. But not surprisingly, they decided they'd prefer to be campaigning. And so they said they're not going to come back until mid-November. So now both the House and Senate are out and campaigns are in full swing. And the elections will obviously be on November 8th. Let me see, for some reason, there we go. So we're going to talk through a variety of things, kind of like what the makeup of the elections look like this year, and the different things that are going to be impacting, how they might turn out. Biden's approval rating, we'll talk a lot about historical trends for midterm elections. the way they sort of normally swing, some of the administration's accomplishments that they're going to be running on, some of the key issues on both sides that are really going to drive both turnout and the way folks are voting in this election. And then we'll talk generally about the race for the House and some of the trends we're seeing there. The race for the Senate, we'll talk about some of the individual races on the Senate side, and then how the ultimate results will potentially impact what Congress looks like and what leadership will be next year. So just to kind of set the stage, you constantly hear we live in a very divided environment, divided Congress. Nothing makes that more clear than the 50-50 Senate. We've got 50 members caucusing with the Democrats, 50 members caucusing with the Republicans. So obviously the Senate will be hotly contested, as both parties will be trying to gain a majority going into next year. And then a very, very close House. The numbers vary a little bit depending on, there have been some resignations and other stuff, but 220 Democrats, it might be 219 is the most recent number, and then 211 or 212 Republicans. Basically, it's a five seat swing in the House. And so if Republicans can pick up 5 seats, which is not a lot when you're talking about the House of Representatives, then they would take the majority. We'll talk a little bit about being a midterm election year, how traditionally the party that's not in the White House has a big advantage. I will say, I'd love to make it, it'll be hard obviously to make this conversational, but if folks have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Michelle's going to be monitoring that. And I don't think there's any reason we have to wait until the end. If folks have questions along the way, please ask them. Michelle can chime in with those questions, and we'll make this as conversational as possible. Sorry, there we go. So Biden's approval rating. And first I'll say, why is this important? Because it kind of sets the stage for the entire midterms. Very often when it's the president's first term and they enter the midterm elections, the elections really are a referendum on that president. We've seen that historically. At this point in his presidency, Biden has a 45% approval rating. It's been in the low 40s for most of the last year or two. It's crept up a little bit recently, and it's comparable to where President Obama was at this time in his presidency. In August 2010, President Obama had a 44% approval rating. President Clinton had a 41% approval rating in August of 94. Trump in August of 18 had a 41%. And so, at first glance, you might say, well, he's doing about the same as these other presidents were. But as we'll talk more about, if you remember the 2010 midterm elections, they did not go well for Democrats. That was an overwhelming year for Republicans, and similar to 94. Of course, 94 was when Newt Gingrich had the contract with America and won big majorities in the House and the Senate. And so historically, Biden is in a tough spot. As we get closer to the election, when you look at the favorability numbers of Republicans and Democrats, they have tightened some. As you'll see, both parties are underwater. They're under that 50% mark in terms of favorability, and with higher unfavorables. But as we've gotten closer to the end of the summer, both parties have narrowed a little bit where their favorables and unfavorables have come together a bit. When you look at what they call a generic poll, when you ask voters, would you prefer a Democrat or Republican? Democrats still, despite sort of the various headwinds out there in the political environment right now, they still do pretty well in these generic polls. As you'll see, the 43-39 in one poll, there was 47-42, which was actually maybe a bit of an outlier, and then a 44.8 to 43.4. Democrats having a slight advantage with that generic poll, but there are a couple of factors that you have to take into account. Democrats always tend to do a little better on the generic poll. The map sort of traditionally favors Republicans in that Democrats tend to be more concentrated in urban areas. Republicans are more concentrated in rural areas, which makes the map a little more favorable to them. And so they say in order for a Democrat to break even, or for the Democratic Party to break even, they really need to be at least 2% above Republicans on the generic poll. So something to keep in mind, but these numbers do kind of, go a little against the conventional wisdom that it's just going to be a blowout year for Republicans. So historical trends. I talked a little bit about 94 and 2010. And so if you look at some of these big years, so if you go back to the House of Representatives in 1994, Democrats lost 52 seats. That's a lot of seats. And then 2006, if you remember, 2006 was a really big year for Democrats. They lost 30 seats. And then in 2010, Republicans came back and won, and Democrats actually lost 63 seats. Now, they had big wins in 2006 and 2008. So they had a big majority going into 2010, Democrats did, but they lost 63 seats. And then if you go down to the bottom chart and think about and look at the Senate, similar numbers in most of the years. 1994, they lost 8 Senate seats, lost the majority. 2006, Republicans lost 6 Senate seats, lost the majority. And then in 2010, Democrats lost 6 Senate seats and lost the majority. And then 2014, they lost a whopping 9 Senate seats. One outlier was the Senate in 2018. While Republicans lost 40 seats in 2018, that was obviously Trump's first midterm election. They were able to pick up 2 seats in the Senate. And a couple other ones I'll point out, elections that kind of defied conventional wisdom, was 1998. That was right when the impeachment stuff was heating up around President Clinton, and Democrats actually outperformed and picked up seats. And then in 2002, it was the first midterm election for George W. Bush. Conventional wisdom was that he was probably going to lose big. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. The country sort of rallied around his leadership, and Republicans ended up picking up seats in 2002. So there are exceptions to the rule in terms of the losing seats in the first midterm election, although they've been rare. And just to kind of highlight that point once again, President Clinton obviously, had big losses. In 2006, Bush, while he survived 2002 and actually picked up seats, in 2006, his first midterm of his second term, he did lose significant seats in both the House and the Senate. And then President Obama, 2010 was a pretty brutal year for him, losing 63 seats in the House. And then 2014, not as bad, although they lost 9 seats in the Senate. So lost the majority there. And then President Trump lost the 40 seats in the House, but did end up picking up 2 seats in the Senate. And then again, when you sort of correlate this to the president's approval rating, and you look at some of those big years like 1994, Clinton's approval rating was at 46%, and he lost the 52 seats. In 2006, Obama was down to 38%, and he lost the, President Bush was down to 38% and lost the 30 seats. And then President Obama in 2010 had a 45% approval rating and lost the 63 seats. So that's kind of the correlation of talking about Biden's approval rating, and how when you have approval rating in the 40s and you're going into that first midterm election, the cards are kind of stacked against you in terms of historically the way a lot of these elections go. And that's why they've been talking, until recently, where the conversations changed a little bit. There had been a lot of talk about the red wave and how Republicans were going to really win big in this election. It really comes down to these historic factors, as well as some things, obviously, that are going on with the economy. A big issue for midterms is turnout. And so sort of when we talked about the generic ballot, and I said Democrats always have a slight edge in the generic ballot, generally Democrats, just in terms of voter registration, have more voters, but they don't always turn out as well. And so it really becomes a turnout game. If all registered voters turned out, Democrats would win a lot more often. But a lot of times the turnout is not as strong among Democrats. And then when you look at a congressional midterm, you don't have nearly the turnout that you have in a presidential race. And so there are exceptions to that. There are years that folks get really energized. This might be one of those years because some of the issues we're going to be talking about. But turnout, is a big indication of where things are going to go for a midterm. And if you just look at the chart, obviously the greenish color is the midterm turnout, and then the yellow is a presidential year. And so it's, obviously consistently higher in a presidential year in terms of who's turning out. So that's kind of the case. Some of the reasons why the cards are stacked against Democrats going into these midterms, and why Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans are feeling really confident, especially about the House of Representatives. But Democrats have had some wind at their sails recently. And part of that is some of the legislative accomplishments that President Biden and Leader Schumer have managed to get through Congress. And they're going to be running on those accomplishments. That's one of the reasons we've seen President Biden's approval ratings tick up a few points in recent weeks. And so I just wanted to hit on some of those. The first, this was back in the fall of 2021, was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This was a bipartisan bill. It got more bipartisan support in the Senate than in the House. It became more of a partisan issue in the House. But, a big infrastructure and investment bill is something that both parties have been talking about for a long time. It was a priority for President Obama. He was never able to get it done. Trump said it was one of the first things he was going to do when he came into office. They were never able to get it over the finish line. And so, this wasn't a massive bill in terms of some of the things they talked about for infrastructure, but it did have a lot of that, public transit, broadband funding, water infrastructure, a lot of the kind of heavy transportation infrastructure type products that they had been trying to fund for a long time. And so that was something that got a little lost in the mix with all the partisan rhetoric, but that Biden is trying to capitalize on and highlight that he actually got this done. Another bipartisan thing that got done after some of the tragedies that happened in Texas and Michigan and other places was gun legislation. And this, as far as gun legislation goes, it was a pretty modest bill, but just the fact that they were able to get anything passed that was bipartisan around guns was a really big deal. So in June, on June 25th, Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It had a background check expansion. It had red flag laws and programs. It increased funding around that. There was a big component on mental health and school safety, and also some new rules around straw purchases. So another bipartisan issue that Biden was able to get through. And then the CHIPS Act was another bipartisan bill that they passed at the end of July. It did get scaled down a little bit. This is the bill that had like 5 different names. It was called the China Competitiveness, the Innovation Competitiveness Bill. And essentially, one of the main focuses was on support for domestic semiconductor manufacturing to try to beef that up with the whole semiconductor shortage around cars and other products. But it also had significant funding through the National Science Foundation to try to increase competitiveness here in the US. And then with the Department of Energy, lots of stuff around energy, technology, microelectronics. And so this was the bill that, McConnell ended up supporting. Republicans rallied behind at the end. And then as soon as they got it passed was when Democrats released, when Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer released the details of the Inflation Reduction Act, which angered some Republicans because they kind of saw it as a little bit of a bait and switch. Folks thought that the Inflation Reduction Act was dead at that point. It kind of got revived. Obviously, Inflation Reduction Act had initially been the Build Back Better bill, which was a much larger package that was never able to get complete traction among Democrats. Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema had shared their concerns and had come out against it. But the scaled down Inflation Reduction Act is what passed here in August and got signed into law. Of course, it had the IRS, the $80 billion in IRS funding that NAEA has been pushing for and watching very closely, but a number of other things. It had the 15% minimum corporate tax, prescription drug pricing reform, a 1% stock buyback tax, of course, all the tax credits that you guys are working on around electric cars and other climate provisions. And so those were kind of when we've seen a little bit of wind behind the sails for Democrats since the end of summer. It's really that legislative accomplishment that Biden was able to pull off. There was a lot of skepticism in such a divided Congress and even divided among the Democrats in the Senate that he would be able to pass a big package. And when you look at what has passed this year, it's actually pretty significant. And so that's given a bit of a lift to Biden, which helps counteract some of those historic trends. But really, there's a couple of big issues that have been front and center in this election, and they really come down to the economy and inflation, and also abortion. And there are a few others that are emerging as well, like immigration and crime. The last couple of weeks has taken on a bigger role, so we'll talk a second about that. But I'll start with inflation. There's a lot of anger out there around inflation because coming out of COVID, there were obviously major supply chain issues happening, and folks were really told that the increase in prices and the inflation was transitory. Once the supply chains loosened back up, once things got back to a sort of a post-COVID environment, that we would not continue to see these price increases. Most economists were even saying that. And of course, inflation sort of continued to rise, continued to accelerate, and put a real drain on the economy. And then, led to the interest rate increases we've seen recently, which has really hit the markets. It's tamped down hiring a little bit. Hiring is still pretty strong. But this has been kind of the Republican, issue. And Republicans really thought they could run on the economy and increasing inflation in this election, and it would be a slam dunk. But then the Supreme Court came out and reversed Roe v. Wade, and the narrative became a little more mixed, because abortion has been an incredibly motivating issue for many women voters, for many Democrats. It's kind of fired up the Democratic base and started to change the narrative a little bit. There was a lot of apathy among Democrats that were not excited about Biden and his agenda, had felt like he had not done enough, and it was looking like turnout might be low on the Democratic side, and abortion really changed that narrative. We've seen a few special elections where there were, districts that Trump had won, where the Republicans were the favorite to win, but where abortion became a major issue in the election, and the Democrat ended up winning. We saw the referendum in Kansas, where an anti-abortion referendum was voted down overwhelmingly in a state that is not considered a super Democratic state. And so this has kind of changed the dynamics of the race. The question is how much, you've got kind of all these competing issues with inflation increasing, people still feeling that pain and having some sort of animosity towards the administration because of where the economy is. And then you've got on the other side a lot of suburban voters, a lot of women voters that are fired up about the reversal of Roe v. Wade and are motivated to go out and vote for Democrats as a result, even if they don't agree with everything that Democrats have been doing. And then some of these other issues like crime and immigration have kind of emerged in recent weeks. Republicans have tacked a little bit and focused on those as well, sort of the more cultural issues. So that all kind of sets the stage of, we've got a lot of competing issues. I'll also say we're about 5 weeks, 4.5 weeks, I guess exactly 5 weeks maybe out from the election, and a lot can change between now and the election. And so while these trends are kind of the competing factors, I think there's still a lot of fluidity in terms of who has the momentum. But you'll see the map again: 221 Democrats, 212 Republicans. If Republicans just swing 5 seats, they take the majority. When you look at the map in terms of who's up for re-election, who's retired, how the redrawing of the districts worked out as part of the census, Republicans have a slight sort of advantage with the map. And the way the seats have been ranked, there are 212 races. This is according to the Cook Political Report. 212 races that are at least leaning GOP. 192 races that are at least leaning Democratic, and then 31 toss-up races. And so for Democrats to keep the House, they would really have to win almost all of the toss-up races. And so that's why sort of the conventional wisdom has been, it's going to be really hard for Democrats to keep the House, even if they have a really, really good night, even if abortion continues to be like one of the driving issues, just because the numbers don't look great in terms of the open seats. In terms of retirements, you had I think it was 38 or 36 Democrats retire. You had 28 Republicans retire. So the 36 Democrats retire gets a lot of attention. The Republican number doesn't get as much, but there were sort of more open seats out there that were sort of in the Democratic column that also just make it more competitive. Let's see if we have a question here. there was a question on student loan forgiveness. We'll talk about that in a bit. So the toss-up House races, I won't really get into a lot of the individual House races. We can do that more with the Senate. But I will say it kind of comes down to a few different types of races. You've got the white collar suburbs. You'll see Sharice Davids in Kansas City. That's one where it's a suburban Kansas City district. In a normal year, you would that seat might go Republican in a midterm election like this. But I think because of the abortion issue, it's now leaning more Democratic. You've got the what we'll call the blue collar bastions, which are sort of the Midwestern manufacturing districts. These are folks that or these are districts that went for Trump, that maybe they were Clinton supporters back in the day. They're kind of blue collar union type workers, but started trending more towards Trump in recent years. And those are folks that are definitely hit by inflation. And so those are the type districts that are harder to keep. The Latino vote is interesting, the Hispanic vote, because traditionally Democrats have done better among Hispanic voters. But we saw in 2020 that Trump actually improved dramatically, especially when you look at South Texas, South Florida. And a lot of that was issues like crime and borders, and also sort of the fear of there was a lot of talk of socialism, and Trump was able to capture sort of a larger percentage of that Latino vote. So it'll be interesting to see how that swings in some of these states, whether it's Florida, Texas, California, where there's some heated congressional races. And then, another thing is, and this is very apparent in the Senate, but it also is the case in the House, is the quality of the candidates, especially on the Republican side. You had a lot of MAGA sort of Trump centric candidates that got involved in the primaries. Some of them are not great general election candidates. Maybe their message was that the 2020 election was stolen, things along that line, very aligned with some of the more extreme parts of President Trump's agenda. Were able to win the Republican primary, but perhaps are not as well situated for the general election. So that's another thing we're watching. There are a few, while most of the vulnerable sort of incumbents are on the Democratic side, there are also some more urban Republican incumbents in places like Cincinnati, Arizona. Steve Chabot in Cincinnati has got a tough race just because that district with the redistricting has become more Democratic. And then there are open seats with all these retirements where folks are just battling it out. Go to the next slide. So for the House, I'll just sort of sum it up. Obviously, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. I think that, a few months ago, the conventional wisdom was it was going to be a wave election where Republicans would win overwhelmingly. I think that is probably not the case anymore. But when you look at the historic trends, when you look at the map, it's still sort of highly likely that Republicans take the House. For them taking those 5 seats back to take the House, that's not a super high threshold. And so I think we could, easily see Republicans picking up, let's say 15, 20 seats and taking the House back. Now, we still have 5 weeks to go. It's not impossible that something could change in that narrative and Democrats could still manage to win. But I think it's probably a much lower percentage that Democrats manage to hold on to the House. The Senate, on the other hand, is much, much closer. I think it's probably 50-50 right now where that comes out. And we'll get into some of those races here. So 50-50, of course, there are two independents that are caucusing with the Democrats. And you look at some of the races that are out there. Republicans had a really tough map this year in terms of who was up for reelection, who, what kind of states they had to defend. But I'll first look at some of the Democratic races that are being defended. One is in Colorado. Senator Michael Bennet has a tough opponent who is O'Day is a moderate businessman. He's actually pro-choice and has sort of a record of accomplishment as a businessman. And so while Senator Bennet has been leading in the polls and will probably be able to pull that out, he's got a pretty tough race. That's one of the primaries where there was a sort of a Donald Trump candidate, and then there was this businessman candidate. Democrats actually supported in the primary the Trump candidate. A lot of money was put in that race because they thought he would be easy for Bennet to win and to beat in a state like Colorado. But the moderate won, and so Bennett's got a race. Still leans Democratic, but one that we're watching. And then Senator Hassan in New Hampshire, former governor running for re-election to the Senate, has that's a race where it looked like it was going to be very close, but the nominee for the Republicans, they just had their primary on September 15th, so it was pretty late primary. Does not look as strong as it could have been, and folks tend to think that she'll probably pull it off. And then Kelly in Arizona, Warnock in Georgia, and Cortez Masto in Nevada. We'll talk a little more about them because those are all hot races. And then on the Republican side, Rubio definitely is leading in that race against Val Demings. There's an open seat in North Carolina that's really tightened, even though Democrats have not won a Senate seat in North Carolina since 2008 with Kay Hagan. That race is tightened, but still probably leans Republican. And then Ohio is a very interesting race. And then Wisconsin, Senator Ron Johnson is running for re-election. And so here's kind of a map that shows everything that's up, and I'll walk through some of these individual Senate races because they are interesting to think about. Pennsylvania, we've got John Fetterman. Folks may have seen the pictures of him. He wears the black sweatshirt with the hoodie, has tattoos, does not look like your typical politician or typical senator. And then he's running against Dr. Oz, who's the TV doctor. And so that's been a very colorful race. Fetterman has had the edge in that race, although he had a stroke about 6 weeks ago, and there have been some issues about his health. That race has tightened. I think Fetterman still probably has the edge, but that one could go down to the wire. And then in Georgia, you've got Senator Warnock, who won just 2 years ago in a special election, has raised a ton of money. He's raised about $25 million every quarter. And he's running against former football star Herschel Walker. That race is extremely close. Herschel Walker has made a ton of mistakes in this election. He's, stuff has come out about his background, about his marriages, about various family things. He has not been a super strong candidate, but he's managed to keep that very tight. And so I think that race could very well go down to the wire. Wisconsin, Senator Johnson is a very conservative senator. And it always looks like he could get beat in Wisconsin, but then he somehow manages to pull it off. And this one will likely go down to the wire again. He's running against the lieutenant governor there. Arizona, this is one that has come down to really quality of the candidates. So Mark Kelly, former astronaut, is seen as a moderate, very popular, is running against Blake Masters, who, even though Arizona is definitely a swing state, Blake Masters has not been a great candidate. So most are giving Mark Kelly the edge there. And then North Carolina, where we have that open seat, as I said, that one is looking like it's going to be very close, although Republicans have the edge. New Hampshire, we talked a little bit about. Nevada might be Republicans' best pickup opportunity. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto is in a very tight reelection. That's one where the Hispanic vote is going to be pretty decisive. With Adam Laxalt, who's he is the Attorney General out there. His grandfather was a senator. It's a big political family in Nevada. And then in Florida, Marco Rubio does have the edge on Val Demings, although that race is one that's being watched closely. Ohio is one. J.D. Vance, who wrote the Hillbilly Elegy a few years ago, which was a great book, kind of sprung to fame, announced he was running, first-time candidate. There was a contested primary there. I believe Trump ended up endorsing him in the primary. He got out of the primary, but he has proved to not be a very good, candidate. And Tim Ryan, who's a congressman from Ohio, that he had tried to run against Pelosi for leadership, has just run a better campaign than expected. And so that race actually could come down to the wire, even though Republicans have tended to do better in recent years in Ohio. So we'll talk about the impact, but just to sum up the Senate stuff, I think it's 50-50 whether Dems are able to hold on to their slim majority, pick up a seat or two, or whether Republicans pick up a seat or two. But Democrats are definitely much more well situated in the Senate this year, just because of the map, how some of these races have shaken out, than they are in the House. And so I think a very likely scenario could be we keep a Democratic majority in the Senate, but we have a Republican majority in the House, and of course Biden in the White House. So whenever you have a new Congress, whether the parties change or not, there's change, because folks retire, folks lose, new leadership comes in, the committees sort of recalibrate their numbers. When you have a new party take over, there's dramatic change. And so this just sort of shows some of the potential leadership changes if Republicans win the House. I think Kevin McCarthy is the favorite to be the Speaker of the House. That will probably happen. He might have to cut some deals with kind of the Trump wing of the party in order, and sort of the conservative groups within the House Republican Conference, in order to get that leadership role. And then down the spectrum, the leadership will likely be Steve Scalise as majority leader, with Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, and on down the line. You'll see there could be some contested races for majority whip, for conference chair. And then it'll shake out into the committees. One of the committees that we've been looking at closely is Ways and Means, obviously the tax writing committee. We did an event for Vern Buchanan. We attended an event for Adrian Smith. And then there's Jason Smith. Those are kind of the three individuals that are battling it out to be the Ways and Means chairman, which is a major post for in every Congress. A little bit more on McCarthy and Scalise as well. I think one of the questions is what happens with Pelosi. If Democrats lose, I think she's very likely to step down. Democratic leadership in the House is pretty old. You've got Steny Hoyer, who's also in his 80s, I believe, and then Jim Clyburn, who's also about the same age. And so the top three folks in the Senate right now, Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn, are all old. And so the question is, if Pelosi steps down, do they all step down? Is Hoyer in a position where he could take over as, let's say they're in the minority, as minority leader? Or does it go to a younger person like Hakeem Jeffries from New York is someone that's been talked about? And so that's kind of the wild card of what happens on the Dem side. And then in the Senate, it's going to be pretty stable. I think you've got McConnell as either minority leader or majority leader, and then Schumer is pretty safe there as well. One interesting thing that folks probably saw in the news this week was Trump going after Mitch McConnell on Friday. This has happened before, but he really went after him and went after his wife. And so it just shows the some of the animosity within the Republican Party. And I will say, I forgot to say this earlier, when we talked about some of the mixed factors in terms of what's sort of helping Republicans and what's hurting Republicans. Most folks put Trump in the category of hurting Republicans. Just the fact that he's still in the news, that he's still grabbing headlines. You know, he is doing some campaigning in some districts. He's seen as helpful, but it's generally been sort of in that bucket of things like some of the legislative accomplishments or some of the abortion stuff that tends to be helping Democrats more, at least on the margins. So let's just say, what if we do have a divided Congress? What if we have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate? Or what if we have a Republican Senate and House and a Democratic president? What does that mean? What does divided government mean moving forward? I like to say gridlock versus bipartisanship. A divided government, could force compromise. When you look historically, what happened between 94 and 96, Clinton went in and cut a lot of deals with Newt Gingrich, and they got a lot of stuff done. When you look at between 2010 and 2012, I think there was a little bit of that. But in more recent years, I think when it's been divided, we've seen more gridlock. But President Biden does, bill himself as a pragmatic deal maker. Anything to get done in the Senate, unless you had 60 votes, will require bipartisanship. And so there could be some opportunities for folks to work together. The negative outlook would be you've got extremes in both parties. It's going to be hard to reach a compromise. The debt limit default and government shutdown are going to be at risk. Those are going to be major issues. And then, of course, 2024 will likely, start to ramp up right after the election, if not, early in the new year. And so it's going to make it hard with a divided government to get stuff done. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'll say just sort of on the tax front and the IRS funding, I think that will be an issue going into the new year. McCarthy announced about a week and a half ago that one of the first things they wanted to do if they took over Congress was to roll back some of that IRS funding. Adrian Smith, who's running for Ways and Means Chairman, has said he'll be the sponsor of that bill. He's touted that bill. One thing that we've, as NAEA, have been reminding all of these offices are this is not just about audits and about enforcement. This is about customer service, better technology, creating a system that works for taxpayers, that actually helps taxpayers. And we have told offices that. We said that to Adrian Smith last week after he was touting this bill, and he kind of came back and said, yeah, I get the customer service piece. We're all for, improving customer service, because the reality is they can sponsor those bills and even pass them all they want, but President Biden is not going to as long as he's in office, he's not going to allow the IRS funding to roll back. So that's one impact that we're watching closely, is how this plays out with the additional IRS funding, but also just the ability of Congress to pass tax legislation. Will there be more of that, or will there be less of that? And I think most of those things are kind of yet to be seen, but it definitely will have an impact on the way Washington operates. So I see we're at 150. I've talked way too much, and so there is one question. I would encourage folks to please put your questions in the Q&A. Michelle can read them up, but I'll start with this first one. It says many in Congress want more student loan forgiveness, but no bill has been introduced. And I'm not sure if that's totally correct. There might be some bills out there that have been out there for a while. The student loan forgiveness is an interesting issue because Republicans have really rallied around the idea that this was not a good thing, that this is not fair, that your average sort of American doesn't want loans to be forgiven, which might be folks from wealthier families. And then Biden himself was a little conflicted about this. I heard a Democrat say last week that he wished they had just lowered the interest rates dramatically and used the money that way, as opposed to wiping out $10,000. But there was a lot of pressure within the Democratic Party, a lot of pressure within the White House for them to do something on student loans. And so they did this $10,000 loan forgiveness. I think politically, it's actually served them pretty well. And so, but there are lots of different opinions on that. I don't think there's the will in Congress to do more. I mean, there's definitely not. And I think folks have strong opinions on both sides about what Biden's done so far, if that was positive or not. Michelle, you want to read some of these?
Yes. Hey, Thad.
Hey.
Somebody's asking, what are the odds for getting people out to vote?
So I think a couple of things. Midterm elections are normally less turnout than the presidential election. But there's some issues that have fired folks up. Republicans are excited about the opportunity to potentially take back the House, take back Congress. And so I think, there was some excitement among Republicans to get out to vote. And then there's these, a few key issues that have really energized Democrats, the largest being the abortion issue. And so I think between those two things, there's going to be a decent turnout, but it is always a challenge in the midterms to get strong turnout.
What about the extenders? What's your thoughts on that? Getting extenders passed?
Yeah, so good question. So I think it's too early to say, and I hate to say that because we are getting closer, but the conventional wisdom. So the CR, the continuing resolution, passed until December 16th. Congress will come back mid-November. And so they basically have 1 month, which will be the lame duck session. And the hope of most of leadership is that they pass a big package that will include a funding bill for FY23. And you've got Senator Shelby, who's the ranking member on Appropriations Committee, and Senator Leahy, who's the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. They're both retiring. They feel very strongly about getting a bill done. And so there's going to be a lot of desire to strike a deal and get a bill done. But there are elements within the Republican House that are going to be, not interested in voting for a big spending package, which I think is going to be the challenge. If there is a vehicle, it will likely include some tax stuff. The Secure 2.0 retirement bill is kind of top of the list. Some of the extenders around the R&D tax credit are on that list. the question is, how do they end up doing a comprehensive extenders package with a lot of tax provisions? Or do things get so kind of adversarial that they kind of keep it to a minimum? And so I think it's unclear at this point, although, you know, the potential vehicle for an extenders package would be the spending bill at the end of the year. In terms of prepare regulation, so, you know, one unfortunate thing, this isn't a huge obstacle, because we'll be able to find, you know, new champions in the new Congress, but we did lose Congressman Tom Rice from South Carolina, was our Republican co-sponsor, along with Jimmy Panetta, of the prepare bill in the House. He unfortunately lost in a primary down in South Carolina, so he's not going to be with us anymore. There's been, you know, it's been a tricky bill, because there's been some bipartisan support for the bill. There's been strong bipartisan support, but there's also a feeling that that IRS needs to be completely on board with the legislation before they move it forward, and that some of the states like Oregon that have their own regulatory regimes are sort of kosher with what we're doing. And so that has caused it to stall a little more than we would have liked. It is not really teed up to be in a end of the year package. I mean, most of the stuff that's going to go in the end of the year package is completely baked. It's got, you know, total bipartisan support and has been vetted. And so one of our top priorities moving into the next year will be, how do we move this, you know, bill forward on prepare regulation? There's also just been a lot of other priorities among the committee leadership in terms of all the COVID relief, all the IRS funding sort of recently taking up a lot of oxygen, the new IRS commissioner who will, you know, hopefully get nominated. And so it's been tough to break through all of that to make this a priority of the committee. But we continue to push it, and it's going to be sort of a top goal going into next year.
Got a question about 3855 to make accounting a STEM profession. Any thoughts on that?
I have not heard that that's got a ton of traction, but I'm not totally sure. But as far as I know, that's not teed up to, you know, pass before the end of the year.
Well, thank you, Thad. That was interesting and enlightening as always. Thank you for all your insight. It's really helpful. And you mentioned the commissioner and, you know, the appointment of the new one. What are the chances that we'll see a nomination before the end of the calendar year?
So, I mean, I think the chances of seeing a nomination for the end of the calendar year are probably pretty good. I can't imagine they would wait until after January. In terms of it actually getting acted on before the end of the year, I think it's getting tougher just because we're already, you know, into October. They'd sort of have to do all of this between November 15th and December 15th in terms of have a hearing, voted out of the Senate. And so I'm less bullish on that, but you know, we've heard, and I think we've said on these things before, we've heard that the White House has someone that they're vetting who's a former CEO, someone that would be very qualified. And but that's been going on for a couple months now. So at this point, you have to believe they're probably waiting until after the election to release anybody.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for your remarks today. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending. Just a reminder that we have these quarterly updates just to talk about what's going on the Hill and NAEA's work and advocacy. I can assure you when we know more about what's happening with the IRS Commissioner, you will know as well. And I hope you all have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Meg. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.